Welcome to this presentation of the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series featuring artist Philippa P.B. Hughes. I'm Jim Leha, Deputy Director for Public Experience and Learning at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. This presentation was created in partnership with the museum as part of our Vote 2020 program and the University of Michigan Democracy and Debate theme semester. Philippa Hughes describes herself as a social sculptor and creative strategist who produces art-fueled projects that spark humanizing and authentic conversations across political, social, and cultural divides. She is an evangelist for the dismantling of the polarization industrial complex, one conversation at a time. Philippa has designed and produced hundreds of creative activations since 2007 for curious folks to engage with art and one another in unconventional and meaningful ways. She leads Curiosity Connects Us, a partner in Looking for America, a national series inviting politically diverse guests to break bread and talk to each other face to face using art as a starting point for relationship-building conversations. I first met Philippa at a Looking for America dinner at the Detroit Historical Society for over 100 politically diverse Michiganders. Among them were an Indigenous woman who spoke proudly of her tribe's religious practices, a young Republican politician who spoke about his passion for public education, and a Chaldean American woman who reflected on her family's deep roots in Metro Detroit. That dinner was a revelation. A reminder of the empathy and collaboration that's possible when we let down our defenses and seek community instead of combat across the political divide. In advance of her presentation, Philippa led two conversations with University of Michigan students via Zoom. I want to thank the students who participated, including those from U of M's We Listen organization and the Museum of Art's Student Engagement Council. And now, I hope you enjoy Philippa's presentation, Dismantling the Polarization Industrial Complex.
My name is Philippa Hughes, and I used to be a lawyer. My area of specialty, investment advisor regulation. I wore sensible shoes and pantyhose, and I build my life away in 6-minute increments. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out best practices for exciting things like soft dollars, wrap fees, and trade allocations. I was bored. I was really bored. I yearned for something inspiring and creative in my life. I attended lots of theater, dance, and music performances and looked at a lot of art. But what I really wanted was an opportunity to participate in the creative process. I didn't necessarily want to be an artist. I wanted to actively engage with creative and like-minded people in fun and meaningful ways because I knew that whenever I had the chance to hang out with artists and arts enthusiasts, I always ended up having the most amazing conversations that would inspire amazing thoughts and ideas, and most importantly, that would spur me on to action.
Oh, hi. This is the real Philippa here. Kind of hard to explain what you just saw. That was my friend, Jeffrey Cudlin, my friend, who is an artist here in DC. And he spent the summer impersonating me. I used to have super blonde hair back then. And he decided that he wanted to make a commentary on the DC art world, or on the art world in general, and how so many people were more interested in the scene and the party and less interested in the actual art. And so he decided to use me as sort of the example of where the art world had gone wrong. I think the reason why he did this was because when I first moved to DC, I was actually a lawyer, as I mentioned earlier, and I just was really interested in art, and I really wanted to be part of the art scene. It was partially, I was really bored, and so I would just start going to art events every weekend. At one point, I would go to art events almost every night. And I started to really engage with all the people I was meeting. And I started inviting them over to my house and having salons. Like, I thought of myself as a modern day Gertrude Stein, where I would bring the artists together and we would drink wine and have lofty thoughts. But it kind of worked. I mean, it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And at one point I decided, well, maybe we can have like an art party. And so I found a raw retail space. It was actually right at the end of the block where I lived, and we turned it into an art space and filled it with video art, performance art. We had a bar, and it was amazing. Hundreds of people came. I created events of all different sizes and styles. Sometimes I would invite people over to have discussions with artists, and like small intimate salon style discussions. I started working with museums. Museums, were starting to get more interested in bringing new audiences into their spaces and younger audiences. And so I worked with a couple local museums to create huge events that attracted that kind of audience. I continued to find raw spaces all over the city to organize and produce these large-scale events that would showcase the artists of DC. And it was really fun. And it was really a way not only to show what DC could offer in terms of the art scene, but also to give people a real opportunity to experience what DC could offer. DC has kind of a rightful reputation at some level of being kind of a square, staid kind of city of khaki pants and white shirts. And in fact, there is a rich art scene here that people never really paid attention to or didn't really even know about. Even people who lived here didn't even know about it. So part of my goal was not only to give artists the opportunity to showcase their work, but to give people the opportunity to see what DC was really like and to connect with each other. Now, I'm telling you this in part because it really laid the foundation for all the work that I do currently, which I want to tell you about in a second. But at the time, I didn't really understand what it was I was trying to do. I had this sort of gut instinct that art could connect people to each other, and that if given the space and the opportunity, art could be sort of this subversive way to actually bring people into relationship with one another, to actually give them the opportunity to talk to each other. I knew that, but I couldn't quite make the leap, intellectually from these sort of art parties to the actual connection. That came much later. It took a lot of experimenting, a lot of trying to keep doing it even in the face of criticism, critiques like the kind that Jeffrey Cudlin was offering, which I completely respected, and it actually helped me to do better, to actually improve the experiments that I was trying on people. So I really appreciated those critiques and those opportunities to really try new things. That very same summer, an artist named Agnes Bolt did a project in my apartment that was probably a defining moment for me as an artist. She actually created an experience in my living space in which she built a giant plastic bubble and lived in this bubble in my space for a week. And we interacted with each other according to a set of rules that she laid out. Some of the rules were things like I had to give her a good morning kiss every morning to greet the day. Another rule was, I had to cook her 2 vegetarian meals a day. I really like meat, so that one was actually quite difficult for me to adhere to. By the end of that week, we weren't even speaking to each other. In fact, during the week, we got into a fight that resulted in her actually exiting the bubble and going onto the street and wondering if she would even have a place to stay for the rest of the week. I took her back in, of course, and we dealt with each other through the end of the week, and we've never spoken to each other since. That was in 2011, May of 2011. And I learned so much from that experience, and I see that as a moment when everything kind of started to become more clear to me about how we use art as a way to interact with each other. The set of rules that she established, the creation of the space for our interaction, the importance of the relationship and the interaction between us, that became the most important part of the art piece. Otherwise, it would have just been a giant bubble in the middle of my living room with this woman living inside of it. If we had not had those interactions, the art piece would not have been completed. And so that's where I started thinking about my inspirations for how to move forward with my art practice. I'm really inspired by an artist named Joseph Beuys, who said that the whole act of living is my creative process. And so I started thinking about the art as being our entire environment. And I started to see my home as a studio where I would experiment and try new things. And then I started seeing the whole world as my studio and all the people in it as participants in my art. And so once I started having that view of art beyond things that just hang on the wall or sit on the floor, which I love to collect art. I love going to see art and experiencing art. But once I started to see art as something beyond the objects that hang on the wall, I started to see how art could be actually a powerful force for real transformation in our lives. When people could actually participate in the art, and when the art space became the art piece into itself. And so I slowly started developing this idea for myself of being a social sculptor. Well, I have to say that I did steal that phrase from Joseph Beuys. But I started thinking of myself as a social sculptor, as a person who sculpts space in which social interaction can take place. But it's not enough for me to just have people talking to each other and just building the relationship. That's core and very critical to the art practice. But also those relationships and those conversations must lead toward changing our society for the better. Like, that's the most important piece of this art practice, is it doesn't matter unless we actually have the intention to make the world a better place. So fast forward to November 2016. Right after the election, like all of my friends who are very liberal in this very liberal city, we were pretty upset. Many of my friends became catatonic and paralyzed by the result of the election. I, on the other hand, started inviting people over for dinner, because that's what I do. I started inviting people who voted for Donald Trump to come and sit around my dinner table and talk to me. I wanted to ask them questions. I wanted to hear what they had to say, unfiltered by the media and by all the books and articles that I had read up until that point to try to understand. I wanted to ask them my own questions over dinner. I would make people dinner, and we would break bread together and just talk to each other. That became the basis for Looking for America and for the work that I do now. When I first started inviting Trump voters over to my house for dinner to break bread, because that's how we can have one way we can have better conversations, I wanted to create a sense of delight. And so I decided on a menu of red and blue foods, get it? And it's really hard to make blue foods, by the way. I made something with blue cheese and it didn't really turn out blue, but conceptually it was blue. Anyway, I also made a blueberry and cherry crisp for dessert, because red and blue make purple when they mush together. Get it? Purple.
I am an extreme extrovert. I was having a really hard time filming this presentation because it felt like I was talking to nobody when I was just looking into a camera. So I invited my friend Claire Huschel over to have a conversation with me. She's one of the most highly regarded people in the DC art world. She also just started a consulting business called Scaffold that supports artists. And best of all, she's a graduate of the University of Michigan in art history. I'm pretty excited to have this great conversation with her.
We have become victims of the polarization industrial complex. There's profit to be made from keeping us polarized and telling us that we are in tribes and we cannot talk to these other people. And in fact, if you do, you are a traitor to your tribe. We are being told this message over and over, and we believe it. And in fact, a couple things. One is most people in America are sick and tired of polarization, and we do want to talk to each other. And my anecdotal experience is that when I have created space for people to talk to each other, they want to do this because we can't go on like this, and we know it at some level. It's not even that deep. Like, we know we can't go on like this. There's actually a really good study called The Hidden Tribes that says that 70% of Americans are the exhausted majority, that they are exhausted by this idea of polarization. And that means that 30% of Americans, about 17% on the right and about 13% on the left, are the polarized people who are actually polarized and who are very loud. And so their voices are very loud, and that's why we believe that everybody is polarized when it's actually just, a minority of people who are the ones who are tweeting all the time and who are posting all the articles on social media all the time. So there are polarized people. There's no question about that. But there is profit to be made in polarization. Media profits from it. Politicians profit from it in the sense that they gain more power by keeping us polarized. And so I think that one of the most radical things that we can be doing now is to show that we can actually talk to each other despite what the powerful forces are saying, that they're trying to tell us that we can't. No, we can, and it's really hard to go against what all these powerful forces are telling us to do. But I think it's really radical for us to actually have a conversation with somebody across the political divide. We must dismantle the polarization industrial complex.
I don't really know how I feel about it. I'm really just trying to listen to everyone's perspectives on it as it comes in, and try and just know that I'm not going to be able to it's not coming from first person experience. So any gut instinct that I have probably isn't the first one to go with.
But those are just my thoughts. I welcome differing thoughts, and we could have a discussion about that.
If you're going to defend free speech, you have to defend it on both sides.
Right, no, exactly.
It needs to be open to listening to people's experience other than your own.
So I really do see it from both sides. And it's interesting that we just in this little square conversation had two completely different perspectives of 4th of July.
Sort of learning about the other side and other cultures and other people will definitely sort of reduce that anger and aggressiveness.
I really try to create the space to encourage conversation and to make it feel delightful in some ways. Because what I was trying to go for is having people enter the space and feel like they're somewhere else, like they've been transported into this other world where civil discourse is possible, no matter what they're telling you outside in the real world, that not to talk to each other or you can't talk to each other. In this space, you can talk to each other, and here's how, and we're going to do it. We're going to show them that it's actually possible.
I'm thinking it's a little bit like rules of performance, right? I mean, like a performance ritual, right? Once the stage is set, you know that you're supposed to act in a certain way, right? So we know when we go into a theater, the lights come down, we're quiet. Maybe there's something equivalent in your dinners, right? Where you go into this room and there's literally a set table, and we know that there's a certain ritual that we're supposed to go through, right?
Ritual. That's exactly, I think that's the right word. I think we are creating a set of rituals that we're entering into. And some of them are very familiar to us. We've all been at dinner with strangers at a fancy place. So we all kind of have an idea of how to act. But,
for the Looking for America dinners, we really formalize that ritual. So yes, ritual.
Yeah.
Thank you for
well,
saying
it doesn't
that.
even necessarily need to be fancy.
No,
But
it doesn't.
There's something about that collective gathering
Yeah.
where you just, you know that you stop, you pay attention, you focus in on there's a presence that's required in an environment like that.
Yeah, that's right. It does, and it does not have to be fancy at all. But I will say that I have really insisted, because as we started developing the larger project, we had played around with the ideas of potluck dinners or picnics or whatever, and I think that kind of stuff is awesome. But there was something important to me about giving dinner to people and not making them have to work to come and have dinner, because for me it was sort of like this is my gift to you. I'm going to make you dinner, and I'm asking you to do something kind of hard.
Yeah.
So you just come and do the hard thing, and I will take care of like nourishing you.
Yeah.
So it is. So I think that is part of my ritual too. Is like food is so important to this whole process. I mean, one of the whole basic fundamental ideas is breaking bread together. Like we know that when people break bread together, it brings them together in a different way than if you just yell at each other on the internet. So the breaking bread is so important. So I put a lot of thought into what the food would be. I think I mentioned earlier in the very first dinners I would make red and blue foods, which is really hard to do actually.
Yeah.
But once we started having these catered dinners, always chose comfort foods. Like we would have, I think we had meatloaf at one of the dinners actually, but more comfort foods, things that could be passed so that you would actually have to talk to the person next to you to say, oh, can you hand me that plate of potatoes, or something like that. So I definitely thought about what the food would be. And that reminds me, so I think the blueberry and cherry crisp is just about cooled off enough for us to have some. So why don't I serve us?
I would love it.
Awesome.
Thank you. This is delicious.
You're welcome.
I'm glad that I'm finally having the famous cherry and blueberry crumble. So how did you go from dinner parties here at this table to across town at a historic house museum to multiple cities across the United States?
Yeah, well, at that dinner at the Historic Museum, House Museum, a guy named Dan Wallace came to that dinner. And Dan works at New American Economy. They do immigration research, and they would try to make the case for accepting more immigrants because they have a lot of contributions to make to our country, especially economically. But one of the things that social science tells us is that a lot of times, like, if you throw data at people, it actually pushes them more into their corners, and it makes them be less likely to have their minds changed. And so this organization was looking for different ways to tell stories using arts and culture. How do we tell the story of immigrants without just throwing data at people? And so they were already kind of interested in this kind of storytelling and art. And so Dan and I just got together and we started talking, and we came up with this idea, Looking for America, where we'd go around the country curating art shows in cities everywhere with local artists, and we'd ask them, what does it mean to be an American in your community? And then we organized these large dinners, 50, sometimes the largest one was 88 people.
Wow.
So it was pretty big. And people would come, experience the art and the artist, and then have conversations. So, it was sort of like, what happened here, but sort of adapted to each city.
So I have a question about the relationship between the art and the conversations in these dinners. So is there a one-to-one relationship between the artwork that people are seeing and the conversations that you want them to have? I'm trying to sort of put myself in the room and imagine what it would be like to transfer the conversation from an artwork to politics, or, because if it's about sort of meeting people where they are and seeing different perspectives, how does the art do that? I mean, do you start the conversation with asking people about what they think of the artwork, or?
Another awesome question, Claire. There's kind of a two-part answer to that question. The first part is that, you know, one of the theories of change that I've been kind of playing around with is the connection between creating a sense of awe and wonder in people. And when you create a sense of awe and wonder in a person, that inspires more curiosity. And when people are more curious, they feel more connected to their fellow man. They feel more connected to the fabric of humanity. And so a starting point for curating art for this project is, how do we use the art to provoke a sense of awe and wonder in people so that they will be more curious? So it doesn't necessarily matter, you know, we're not trying to connect the specific art, the content of the specific art, to the conversation. It's more about invoking kind of a feeling of like, oh, like I want people to go, whoa, oh, that's so cool. Like if somebody says, whoa, or that's so cool, then I know that I've sparked a little sense of just, even if it's just the teeniest bit of awe. Because that's all we want, is just a little spark to get from there to being more curious about each other. So that's part one of the answer. But part two is, you know, we've tried to experiment with different ways of using actual art in the conversations. So for example, we hosted several University of Michigan students to talk about politics, but before we got into the politics, we showed them art. In fact, an amazing guy who is the deputy director at the University of Michigan Art Museum, Jim Leha, he developed this really cool deck of cards that I think he calls them the dialogue deck. And the cards actually have images of art that's in the museum's collection. And so each card has questions on the back that are like little prompts about the image. It's really great. The questions are really thoughtful, and they really connect well to the images. So one of the images, we used one of the cards for one of the conversations that we had with the students. And I'm telling you, like, okay, I'm gonna make a little confession. Before when we decided to do the conversations with students, I was a little bit intimidated. Like, I have done probably a couple hundred conversations now at this point across the country with all kinds of people. No worries whatsoever. But I'd never done conversations with college kids. And something about that just intimidated me.
So interesting.
I know. But anyway, so gather the students. We did it on Zoom, of course. And they were amazing. Like, they were saying, you know, picking out things about this art and the things that they were saying.
Oh, that makes me so,
honestly, I'm
so proud as a Michigan alum.
I was blown away.
I love that.
So insightful, so thoughtful. It was amazing. So, you know, I don't know. It was, I mean, in part, I think the art piece was really powerful, but they saw things in there that I was like, whoa, did not see that. So that was really cool. We actually did two conversations. The other conversation, one of the students offered to read a poem that she had written. And that was really powerful too, and it really provoked a lot of conversation. So those are a couple different examples of how we have tried to use art forms to, you know, actually in the conversation to sort of get people talking to each other.
I do think sort of the idea of this bath comes along with this image of like purity and almost like cleanliness. Like the first thought I had was like sort of like washing away sins of America. And the title, like Liberty Renewed, sort of gave me this image of like a fresh start, which I think, given that it was made in the 80s and 90s, was pretty interesting. I'm just like, my head's going to Reagan. People sort of consider him like the restarting of conservatism or like modern conservatism. So yeah, I think the 80s were like definitely characterized by reshaping what it means to be American. And this is sort of a representation of a new, cleaner version almost.
It's called We Are Human. And this is talking about like my Latinx community. So it's called We Are Human. Okay, so Latinx blood runs through our veins. Over time, the seeds planted by our ancestors grew into roots. which grew into a generation unyielding in the midst of a political earthquake. From the beginning of time, we were born into a world of systemic injustices, racism, and the cruelty of people who believe that we are less than. Through this, we garnered the shield of resilience passed on by our ancestors, who told us we were destined to succeed. There was no other way if we wished to survive. However, I'm here to say we're worthy of respect, worthy of resources, and worthy of stay, not because of our bountiful successes, but because we are humans. Humans whose hands pick the food you eat. Humans who pay their dues and taxes. Humans who provide for their family and others. Humans who share the same hopes and dreams, live and in the flesh, humans.
I assume that there's some sort of ground rules that you have, right, that you've developed now over time, because now you're no longer at a small table like this where you can sort of monitor the conversation, right? Now you've got 50 people, 80 people. What are the ground rules? How do you set them?
So I've got 7 sort of things to share with you. 7, I don't want to call them rules. Let's call them agreements, something like that. And I'm going to read them out. And after each one, if you all would just use your reaction emoji to, give a thumbs up or applaud or whatever, just to show that you agree. And if you don't agree, let me know that too. And let's talk about why you don't agree. I think that would be interesting too. Okay, so the first is, these conversations can get kind of uncomfortable. And I think that it's important that we can push through the discomfort to some degree. So, will you at least stay in the conversation through this discomfort long enough to kind of figure out why you're uncomfortable? Will you keep listening to each other even when you feel like you really want to respond and you've got something to say, but will you just keep listening until the person is done with their thought? So one of the things that's kind of interesting, as you probably are aware about our political climate now, is that a lot of times when people disagree with each other, suddenly they become enemies of, you can't even talk. We feel like we can't talk to them anymore. And so I don't believe that. People who disagree with me aren't my enemy. They just think differently. And so, when that happens, will you, if it happens tonight, if somebody disagrees with you, will you agree to ask more questions to try to understand why they think what they believe and why they hold those views? Will you share your stories and personal experiences and not talking points to explain why you hold the beliefs that you hold? Instead of dismissing other ideas because they're different from yours, will you make the case for your own idea? This one is a really hard one for a lot of people. You're kind of going along, telling your story, trying to make your case, and then, you listen to the other person, it's so great, and then you realize you might be wrong, but it's really hard to admit when you're wrong, even if it's just a sliver. Will you try to admit when you think you might be wrong, or that you might have changed your mind a little bit? It's really important to assume that people have best intentions. People aren't actually personally attacking you or trying to hurt you. I think when we assume that they have the best of intentions, and that if you can just dig a little deeper, you can understand what their reasoning is, it makes the conversation better. So will you assume best intentions in each other?
The other really foundational thing is storytelling.
Yeah.
Storytelling is so important on a couple different levels. I mean, one is sort of the obvious level, is it humanizes people. Like, you actually become a real person when I hear about a struggle that you've had that maybe I have felt too. So humanizing is essential, because we are now so used to being avatars to each other.
That's right.
You're
Literally.
just literally an avatar.
Yeah.
You have literally become inhuman to me, because I never actually, not only because I don't see you, but I can't even hear you speak.
Right.
So the humanizing effect is so important. But the second piece, I think, maybe more important, is storytelling, if it's done in a particular way, can help establish more trust between people. Mm-hmm. Because if you use the prompts that ask people to really dig deep into their personal stories, to be vulnerable, it takes a lot of trust to be able to tell stories that make you vulnerable. And so, you know, if I tell you that kind of a story, I have to trust that you're not going to laugh at me or judge me or think worse of me in any way. And when I trust you to do that, I'm going to be more willing to be open to things that you say to me. If you acknowledge the depth of my story, then I know that that means I can be more open to you, and I can be more open to your differing opinions from me. And I think that's probably the more important piece of the storytelling bit than anything.
What I'm really interested in is not knowing about what your political views are just yet, or where you stand on the political spectrum. Like, I really want to know who you are as human beings, as people. And so, you know, instead of talking about where you came from, or, you know, what your major is, whatever, which is all very fascinating, I thought what we could talk about is if you'd each introduce yourself by telling a story of when you felt like you were your best self, when, you know, and not necessarily like in a show-offy way, but just in like when you just felt good about who you are.
I'm Jasper. Hi. My answer is kind of different, I think, but it's what kept sticking out to me when I was thinking of an answer or thinking of a story, I would just say. So probably like a year ago, actually, during the fall semester of 2019, I was having a lot of like mental health problems. You know, I was having a lot of anxiety. I was pretty depressed. I was really irritable. And for like most of the semester, it kind of put me, you know, at a damper on my friends, and my academics were suffering. And it seems small, but like I just remember when I finally, in like towards like the beginning of November, decided that I wanted to like do something to get better, and I like made an appointment with CAPS. It was like honestly like a really big inflection point. I was really proud of myself for being like vulnerable and like humble, and like, you know, having the humility to admit that I have to do something and taking action. And then it's interesting because I can like clearly mark the transition from like fall semester of last year being really terrible to winter semester before COVID happening being like the best time I've ever had, the best like 3 months of my life. It was like an awesome semester. Everything was going great, of course, until we got kicked off campus. But, you know, it's kind of small, but I think that was a moment where I really felt like my best self, because I think a lot of my, I don't know, my ego and a lot of my ambition kind of went away, and I focused on, you know, myself and admitting that, you know, I needed help, admitting that there was something that I could be doing better.
Yeah, so in Looking for America, we asked people to bring an object that they could tell a story about that represented their connection to their community. So people brought in like all kinds of amazing objects. And the object could be like a song or a recipe. You know, it didn't have to be, you know, a piece of paper, you know, a thing. And so it was really cool to see what people brought. And then, of course, it was really amazing to hear the different kinds of stories they told. And, you know, by doing it that way, it kind of gives people sort of a baby step into being more vulnerable. Like, you know, they can focus on something else first, and then we like take them to the next step of digging a little bit deeper into their personal story. But it's a starting point, basically.
Okay, so this picture was actually taken right before my mother and I got on a plane to meet my father in the United States. I don't remember much about the day except for it was really exciting. And I was actually excited because I got to sit on top of a bunch of suitcases and got like wheeled around. But we were all nervous. I also remember my mom made me dress really nice, and I had to wear these tights and they were itchy. But I remember getting on the plane, and then I remember the stewardess, actually, and I remember she had like golden hair, and I was like, wow, she's different. And then I remember she gave us these trays of food, and that was really different for me. And then everything was individual. And you know, for you, just for you, we're used to sharing everything, but I had my own tray just for me. And I remember the glass that she gave me, which was just this glass of water, and it was so crystal clear. And that, yeah, so this is a picture of whenever we kind of left China, and it was the start of everything. in America.
We are here to really grapple with difficult issues, and we are here to stand up for what we believe. It's not about saying that, you know, you need to give up anything. I mean, if your deeply held beliefs are your deeply held beliefs, and you should speak your truth, and you should allow others to speak their truth. And if there is a clash, I love it when there are clashes. If you can speak to how you feel and you can support it with your own experiences, I think that's an amazing thing to be able to do. Now, if your truth is oppression, that's not invited to this table ever. And so we shut that down for sure.
I'm surprised because being raised by my mom, who she was a single mother for 15 years and met my dad and then had my brother and I, you know, she grew up, she raised my brothers throughout the 80s and the 90s. And she and my brothers are dark skinned, so they have a different Black experience than myself. But she raised me with the same mindset, and that was that, like, you know, got the talk pretty early on, like, if you ever get pulled over, put your hands on the wheel, all this stuff, like keep your wallet in a place where it's all, you know, the whole 9 yards, and raised with the knowledge that everything that exists in this is not for me. Everything that exists in this country, or at least, you know, that the implication is that it wasn't built for me. It wasn't built for people like me. Where I'm at, this school, everything, you know, this wasn't intended for people like me in America. Because it wasn't even legal for my parents to get married until like the 50s, you know. So 4 years or so before my mom was born. So that kind of stuff that has been told to me, and all the experiences that my mom has been through, being spit on and all the racist stuff in the workplace, because she worked in like banks and stuff in Portland, Oregon. And I'll tell you, Portland, Oregon is a very racist city, no matter what the media portrays. You know, that all that stuff has like led to me to this day still being surprised when I see white people show up for Black people.
I think I really encourage people to speak from their personal experience, because at the end of the day, like, most people believe that they make well-informed decisions, when in fact, I mean, social science has shown us that most people are not as informed as they think they are. And in fact, the more informed you are in terms of like following the news and whatever, the less likely you are to be persuadable, and more likely you are to actually be wrong, because you refuse to see any other perspectives, and so your views are more likely to be wrong because you won't inform yourself of different viewpoints. So anyway, so it is kind of interesting, like a real foundation to having good conversation is to be willing to be open to other perspectives and to actually ask people about their perspective.
Like, y'all's experiences are like totally validated, and like perception is like 100% reality. And I think the thing that like really gets to me is when someone makes a knee-jerk response that's like tries to invalidate your experience, or like make an argument against like your actual like experience or like being as a person. I'm like, you miss the point there. Yeah, so it, like, thank you so much for like sharing that. It's really interesting to hear, and I feel like this over like the past couple months has sort of been like a wake-up call, just to like, you know what, this is not your time, like this is just your time to like listen and like understand and like really try to empathize with people's experiences, as opposed to just creating an argument instantly against them.
You know, but I do think that one misconception of having a good conversation is, like, we always talk about like ask more questions, and I do think that's really important, but good conversations go both ways. Like, you ask questions, I answer them, then I ask you a question, and then you answer. Like, it has to go both ways.
And you have to be genuinely curious.
You have to be Oh, yes, for sure, because like one thing that bugs the heck out of me is, you know, when people like interrogate you. It's not a real curiosity, it's an when you feel interrogated.
Yeah, it's almost when the questions are actually more about the person asking the question than they are about
Exactly.
Just out of curiosity, can I ask you why you choose to be Republican?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I get that question a lot. So Yeah, at the end of the day, I think I really do believe that America is a place of opportunity. I don't believe it's a perfect system at all. But yeah, just learning about other systems. I do like a lot of like comparative government work, and this has like really been that's like really been an eye-opening experience for me to like see like what we actually have in terms of like free speech and representation and systems like that a lot of countries like don't. That's like one part of it. People can think better for themselves than the government can, and I would much prefer, I guess like this is a difficult way to word this. Sorry, I'm just like thinking through my thoughts.
Yeah,
right?
no worries.
Yeah, I think this idea of like empowering the person over the systems within itself, like if the system is inherently racist, which I do think there are parts of it that are like just effed up. Sorry, I didn't mean to swear. Are just like messed up. Like if the system is inherently racist, like why would you trust the system to run every part of your life? Like wouldn't you prefer yourself? Don't you like have more faith in yourself and in your fellow neighbors to sort of decide what they want to do with their lives, So I guess like that's a question like I always ask people, if you're so like angry and mad at this system, like why do you keep giving it more power? Because it's just proven to be ineffective.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting way of thinking about it. I never thought of that question. And honestly, like
Also, when you're talking about the history of police, specifically police, because to me, like even if like law enforcement and ICE are like the same and a lot of similarities, I think my stance on them is pretty different from one another, because even though there is definitely a lot of history with police, I do think it's a bit of an oversimplification to just say we should completely get rid of them. They don't serve any purpose other than persecuting specific groups of people, which is like, there's definitely a lot of history there for sure. I'm not denying that, but that's kind of my sort of like gut reaction to hearing abolish the police is, well, let's wait for a second. The police are the way a lot of people defend themselves, and a lot of police officers, even though there's a lot of problems in the system, there's a lot of really corrupt individuals, police have hard jobs. They have to go out every day and they don't know if they're going to come back alive or not, and I think it's a really, it's a really tough job to be in, that, there's a lot of good people that have those visions. Like I'm sure Philippa, like I'm sure your cousin is a great man. I don't think, I don't want to say without knowing him that he's racist or has a hateful bone in his body, but it is a tough position. And I think there's a lot of the same people that are saying we should get rid of the police are also saying people should get rid of other ways to defend themselves, like firearms and things like that. And to me, I think it's a little naive to say that if we get rid of these things, then all crime is going to go away and that people aren't going to need a way to still protect themselves. But, it's definitely a very nuanced conversation. And it's interesting, especially to hear specifically like Lupe and Jacob, because I talk to Hannah all the time about this stuff. But it's interesting to hear your guys' perspectives, because it's a perspective that I see a lot on like Twitter and stuff like that. And I do hear like an occasion from my friends, but I don't really get to have like full explained conversations about it.
So how do we cultivate genuine curiosity?
The function of art in this scenario, it's really about, well, what does that mean? What is this image telling me? You think it says that? Oh, I think it says this. And it's a primer almost for the conversation about, you think that way about immigration? Interesting. I think this way about immigration. And my family's experience is this, and your family's experience is that. Interesting. I hadn't heard a story like that before. I think that's what you're getting at. It's like there's the give and take and being curious and tell me more.
It's to tell me more, because the art doesn't even have to be about immigration to show you how to ask questions about immigration.
That's what the exercise is the same.
It's the exercise of it. Yeah. Exactly.
Which is what I love about art.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's truly, it takes practice. And so, one of the things that I won't call it, I'll call it a failure of Looking for America so far, but that which we're trying to fix is that, people would come to these dinners and they would leave, most people would leave saying, this was so amazing, like I never had a conversation like that before, when's the next one?
Yeah.
And we rarely had a next one. In fact, we never had a next one until
in those individual communities.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I would say, oh, but you can organize your own, but it's hard. So,
Yeah.
and I get that. So, that's what we're thinking about next. And so, one of the solutions that we have for that is to develop a fellows program. And in fact, so we have our very first fellow, Amber Paradin, in Northwest Arkansas, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
So she and I started working together last year. She's amazing. And so she has continued sort of the on-the-ground work of organizing. And we just launched a project called Ozark Story Project. It's so good. It's actually going on right now. I am really excited about it because the idea is to collect stories from old-timers and newcomers / immigrants to the Ozarks, and to show how all their stories intersect.
Hey there, my name's Brandon Weston with Ozark Healing Traditions, and I'd like to welcome you to the Ozark Story Project. You've probably brought in a photo with you, something connected to a family story, or maybe just a good memory. And I encourage you to think about this photo as you move through the project. How has the stories being told in that photo influenced your life today? How has it shaped your family? How has it influenced how you interact with the world around you? Your photo will be added with those from other participants to form our tapestry of Ozark folklore. Ozark folklore is an interesting thing to look at. It's not one entity or one body of knowledge that we can point to, but a mixture, a blend, or you might even say a tapestry made from immigrant stories from across the United States and the world itself. All of these stories, intimate to the families that created them, have built upon each other. They've grown and evolved with each other to make what we call Ozark folklore. But as we enter into the modern world, folklore is changing. Folklore is evolving with every new community that comes into contact with it. And as you go through this project, I'd ask that you would think back to your own family stories, your own experience in the Ozarks. How have the stories that your family has given you, or the maybe even remedies, recipes, prayers, songs, traditions, how have all of these traditions, all of these folk beliefs that you're used to, how have these added to what we might call modern Ozark folklore?
And then we're going to give all of those stories to a theater company, a local theater company, and they're going to turn the stories into little mini Zoom plays. And so people will be able to experience the plays on Zoom, and then have conversations with each other. So anyway, so that's what we're doing in Northwest Arkansas with Amber as a fellow there, and then we're going to continue developing that. But now we want to establish fellows in other cities so that we can adapt this model to other cities. We don't have to do the story project in every city. What would work in that city?
Place,
what would make sense in this other place?
And is the idea to pull in, to keep that sort of bipartisan, to keep the sort of the political dialogue as an undercurrent there?
It's the political part is definitely still an undercurrent, but at the end of the day, the real undercurrent is bringing people together who would just not normally talk to each other. So sometimes that means it's a rural-urban divide, which we know that is a really powerful divide in our country. Sometimes it's a racial divide, sometimes it's a cultural divide. So there's this really great book that says that America is actually made up of 11 different cultures, and we are divided by our cultures. And I don't know, that book really just like blew my mind. It was like, oh yeah, like this country is huge, and there's like a lot of different kind of people here, and we don't know anything about those other people that are like in that other part of the country. We think we do. What does it mean to be American when there's 11 different cultures in our country?
To the one person who leaves the dinner and isn't coming back, right? Isn't gonna go to another dinner, isn't going to engage in the fellowship program. What's the one thing that you want that person to leave having learned or acquired?
I hope that they have more curiosity when they leave, even if it's just a microscopic amount of curiosity, because that microscopic amount of curiosity can open up a whole new world. I think about the people who have grown up in an environment where they never saw anybody different from themselves, or lived in a world where all the beliefs were exactly the same. And if we can just crack that open a little bit with just a teeny bit of curiosity, maybe we can smash open the whole thing. And so curiosity, if they can just leave with the barest amount of it, I think that we can really make a change, a real difference in the world.